The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, and by Tuesday afternoon, Noah Brooks had already begun packing his saddlebags. He had not planned on it. He had not planned on much of anything, if he was being honest with himself, which was a habit he had cultivated over 31 years of living close to the land and far from other people. He had a ranch outside of Laramie, Wyoming, a modest spread of 200 acres that he worked mostly alone, with the occasional help of a hired hand named Clyde, who was 70 years old and more useful for conversation than for cattle. Noah had the horses and the open sky and the cold creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property, and for a long time he had told himself that was enough. Then came the letter. It was delivered by the post rider, a young fellow named Marcus who made the rounds twice a week, and who had the unfortunate habit of reading the addresses on envelopes too slowly and with his lips moving. Noah had been mending a section of fence near the road when Marcus came riding up, and he had taken the envelope with dusty fingers and looked at the return address without much expectation. It was from a Mrs. Prudence Holt of Abilene, Kansas. Noah did not know any Mrs. Prudence Holt of Abilene, Kansas. He opened it standing there by the fence, the morning wind pulling at the edges of the paper. Mrs. Holt explained herself quickly. She was the aunt of a young woman named Jennie Garrison, 24 years of age, who had been living with her in Abilene following a series of what Mrs. Holt described as unfortunate circumstances. The girl's father had passed the previous winter. The small farm they had worked together in the Kansas flats had been sold to cover debts. Jennie had come to stay with her aunt, but the arrangement was not a permanent solution, as Mrs. Holt's husband did not have a particularly generous spirit where extended family was concerned. Mrs. Holt had heard of Noah Brooks through her late brother-in-law, who had once passed through Laramie on a cattle drive and had eaten supper at Noah's table. She had heard he was an honest man who worked good land, and she wondered, respectfully, and with full understanding that such a request was unusual, whether he might consider a correspondence that could lead to something more formal. Noah had read that much and paused. He looked out across his fence line, where the spring grass was coming in yellow-green and thin, and he thought about the empty chair at his kitchen table that he had stopped seeing only because he had gotten so used to it being empty. He read on. Mrs. Holt continued by saying that she felt she owed him complete honesty before any correspondence began. Jennie, she wrote, was not a woman who would be easy to describe in flattering terms if flattery required leaving out the truth. She was stubborn as a creek stone, the aunt wrote. She had opinions on every subject and was not shy about voicing them. She had once argued with the town reverend for 45 minutes on a point of scripture and had made him concede the argument. She did not smile at men simply because they were men, and she did not follow instructions simply because they were given to her. She had a temper that could clear a room and a laugh that could fill one back up again. She was the most difficult woman Mrs. Holt had ever encountered in her considerable years, and Mrs. Holt had encountered many women. But she was also, the aunt wrote, kind to animals and children and old people. She could ride a horse better than most men Mrs. Holt had known. She was not afraid of hard work or hard weather. She read everything she could get her hands on and remembered most of it. She had a strong moral sense and held to it even when it cost her. She was honest to a degree that was sometimes painful and sometimes beautiful. And she was worth, Mrs. Holt concluded in the final paragraph, every single mile of whatever distance a man might have to cross to find her. Noah stood very still for a long moment with the letter in his hand and the Wyoming wind moving through his hair. He was saddled before he reached the last word. Not literally, of course. He read the final word, which was sincerely, and then Mrs. Holt's name written in a careful, practiced hand, and then he stood there a moment longer letting the idea of Jennie Garrison settle into him, the way rain settles into dry ground, quickly and deeply, as though there had always been a space there waiting for it. And then he walked back to the barn, and he began making arrangements. It was not a simple thing, riding to Abilene from Laramie. The distance was something close to 700 miles of territory that included open plains, river crossings, and 100 different ways for a man to find himself in trouble if he was not paying attention. Noah was the kind of man who was always paying attention. He told Clyde he would be gone for a while and asked him to keep an eye on the cattle and the horses left behind, and Clyde had looked at him with the knowing expression of a man who had been alive long enough to recognize when another man had been bitten by something he hadn't seen coming. "You are riding to Kansas," Clyde said. It was not a question. "I am riding to Kansas," Noah confirmed. "Because of that letter." "Because of that letter." Clyde had nodded slowly, chewing on the stem of his pipe. "Well," he said, "I have heard of worse reasons to go to Kansas." Noah wrote back to Mrs. Holt first. It was the right thing to do, and he was a man who did the right thing even when it was inconvenient. He wrote that he had received her letter and found it thoroughly interesting, which was the kind of understatement that made his pen feel slightly embarrassed. He asked if he might also have leave to write directly to Miss Garrison, as he felt it would be most appropriate for her to know he was coming, and to have had some say in the matter before he showed up at a door 700 miles from his own. The response came back in 12 days, which was how long it took for a letter to make the round trip between Laramie and Abilene at that time. Mrs. Holt said that yes, he could write to Jennie directly, and she also said that she had informed Jennie of the initial contact, and Jennie had said, and she was quoting directly here, that she was not a piece of furniture to be shipped around the country, and that if any man thought he could ride up to her door and expect her to fold herself neatly into his life like a clean sheet, he had another thing coming. Noah read that 3 times, and then sat down at his kitchen table and wrote the first letter directly to Jennie Garrison. He did not try to charm her. He did not try to present himself as something grander or finer than he was. He wrote that he was 31 years old, that he had a ranch in Wyoming that he had built himself over 8 years of honest work, that he was not a handsome man but was a useful one, that he had read her aunt's letter and been unable to stop thinking about it, and that he thought a woman who could out-argue a reverend on scripture was probably worth listening to. He wrote that he was not interested in a woman who would fold neatly into his life like a clean sheet, because clean sheets were easy to come by and not particularly interesting. He wrote that he had been alone long enough to know that the kind of company he wanted was the kind that made him think, and that from what her aunt had written, she sounded like exactly that kind of company. He wrote that he had no intention of simply riding up to her door and expecting anything, but that he would like very much to write to her, if she was willing, and then perhaps to meet her, if that seemed right after they had corresponded enough to form an honest impression of each other. He signed it with his full name and his address and the name of the ranch, which was called the Pinto Creek Ranch on account of the creek running through it. He sent the letter and went back to mending his fence. 3 weeks later, a letter came back. He recognized the handwriting immediately, though he had never seen it before. It was the handwriting of a person who wrote often and quickly, the letters not particularly neat but very certain, pressing firmly into the paper as though they had things to say and were not going to be timid about saying them. Jennie Garrison wrote that she was 24 years old and was not interested in being judged by any man on the basis of her aunt's description, which she felt had probably made her sound like a difficult mule. She wrote that yes, she was direct, and yes, she had opinions, and no, she was not going to apologize for that. She wrote that her father had raised her to think and to work and to speak her mind, and she intended to keep doing all 3 regardless of what any potential suitor thought about it. She wrote that she had read his letter twice and found it more honest than she had expected, which was a point in his favor, though she was not going to tell him that because she did not want him to get comfortable. She said that she would write to him once, and then they would see. It became many more than once. They wrote to each other for 6 weeks, and Noah found himself counting the days between letters with an attention he usually reserved for weather patterns and cattle conditions. Jennie wrote about everything. She wrote about the books she was reading, which included a volume of poetry she had borrowed from a neighbor and found mostly pretentious but occasionally stunning. She wrote about the horses at her aunt's small stable, particularly a cantankerous bay mare that she had named Obstinate, which she said was the finest horse she had ever ridden and also the most infuriating. She wrote about the Kansas sky, which she missed having to herself, as the town of Abilene in the spring of 1882 was not lacking in population. Abilene had been a proper cattle town, a hub for the Kishom Trail drovers who brought Texas longhorns north through Kansas, though by 1882 the trail drives were shifting west as settlement pushed the grazing lands further out. The town was changing, quieter than its wildest years but still lively enough, still dusty and loud, and full of the kind of people who had gone west looking for something better and were still looking. Jennie wrote about all of it with the clear eye of a person who saw things as they were and was not afraid to say so. She wrote about her father, too, after the third letter. She said that he had been a farmer who believed in the same soil and the same sky all his life, and that she had spent her childhood learning the names of every plant that grew on their land and every star visible from their front porch. She said that losing him and the farm in the same winter had been the kind of loss that changed the shape of everything, the way a river changes when a dam breaks, rushing suddenly in all directions at once. She said she was still getting used to the new shape. Noah wrote back about his own losses because she had been honest with him, and he believed that honesty was the only currency worth spending. He wrote about his parents, who had both died of fever when he was 22, within a month of each other. He wrote about the ranch, which he had built from almost nothing in the years after, pouring into it the energy of a man who needed something to build because everything else had been taken apart. He wrote that the ranch was good land and he was proud of it, but that he had started to wonder recently whether good land without someone to share it with was just a large amount of dirt. Jennie wrote back that she found that sentiment unexpectedly poetic for a man who had described himself as not handsome but useful. Noah wrote back that he was full of surprises. Her reply to that came with a single line at the top, before anything else that said, "I suspect you might be Noah Brooks." And then it went on to other things, as her letters always did, moving from one subject to another with the energy of a person who thought too fast to stop and organize themselves into sections. But he read that first line probably 15 times before he got to the rest of it. He told Clyde about the letters. He did not mean to, but Clyde was the only other person around most days, and he was the kind of old man who listened more than he talked, which made him easy to confide in. "She sounds like trouble," Clyde said, when Noah had described Jennie's habit of arguing with everyone about everything. "She sounds like exactly the right kind of trouble," Noah said. Clyde had looked at him with something that might have been envy in a younger man's eyes and said, "Then you ought to go and get her before someone else does." The decision was not as sudden as it felt, because Noah had been making it quietly since the first letter. He wrote to Jennie and asked if he might come to Abilene to meet her in person, and he made very clear that he expected nothing from such a meeting, except the chance to see whether the person he had been writing to for 6 weeks was as interesting in person as she was on paper. He also made very clear that if she did not wish for him to come, she needed only to say so, and he would respect it entirely. Her answer came in 9 days, which was faster than her usual response time, and it was short for her, only half a page. She wrote that she had thought about it carefully and that she had discussed it with her aunt and that she supposed there was nothing wrong with a man coming to call. As long as he understood, she was not going to pretend to be something she wasn't just because he was making a long ride. She wrote, "Come if you are going to come, but come knowing who you are coming to see." Noah had read that and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, something warm and sure and slightly reckless, and he had saddled his horse by mid-morning. He took his buckskin gelding, a horse he called Drum on account of the way the animal's hooves sounded on hard ground. Drum was 10 years old, steady and strong, the kind of horse that could cover ground all day without complaint. Noah packed for 3 weeks on the road, which was more than enough time to make the journey with reasonable rest stops, and he carried his Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard not because he expected trouble, but because Wyoming and Kansas in 1882 were territories where a man who didn't carry a rifle was a man who trusted entirely too much in the goodness of strangers. The first days of riding took him south across Wyoming's wide grasslands, through country that was still more open sky than anything else, the kind of landscape that made a man feel very small and very awake at the same time. He followed the established routes where he could, stopping at way stations and small towns to water Drum and to eat something hot when it was available. He slept under the open sky twice, and in a boarding house once in a town called Cheyenne, where he ate the best beef stew he had tasted in months, and listened to 2 men in the corner of the dining room arguing about railroad routes. The railroad was changing everything out here. The Union Pacific had pushed through Wyoming more than a decade earlier, and the web of rails was spreading every year, pulling the frontier closer to the east and changing the way men and cattle and goods moved across the land. Noah had thought sometimes about what this territory would look like in 20 years, whether the open range he rode through now would still be open, or whether it would be carved into farms and fenced tight. He did not have a strong feeling about it one way or another. He was not a man who fought the river's current, only tried to understand which way it was running. He crossed into Colorado briefly and then pushed east into Kansas, where the terrain flattened out into something vast and undeniable, a sea of grass under a sky that felt lower here, closer to the earth, as though the land and the heavens had come to some mutual arrangement about keeping company. He had been in Kansas before, briefly, years ago, but he had forgotten how large it felt even in its flatness. He reached Abilene on a Wednesday afternoon in early June, 14 days after leaving his ranch. Abilene was a proper town by this point in its history, though it carried its wilder past like a scar that had mostly healed. There was a main street with a hotel and a dry goods store and a bank and a livery and several establishments of various repute. There were houses on streets that ran perpendicular to the main road, houses with small gardens in front, a few with roses already blooming. It looked like a town that had decided to stay, which not all Western towns managed. Noah went to the livery first to see Drum properly settled, and then he washed up at the town pump as best he could, which was a limited operation after 14 days on the road, and then he asked the liveryman for directions to the residence of a Mrs. Prudence Holt. The liveryman, whose name was apparently Bert, gave him a look that suggested this was not the first time someone had come asking for that address, and said, "That's the house on Elm Street with the green door. You hear about the Garrison girl?" Noah considered several responses and settled on, "I have a letter of introduction." Bert nodded with the knowing expression of a man who knew exactly what kind of letter that was and said, "You got a better chance than the last fellow. He wore too much pomade." Noah found the house on Elm Street without difficulty. It was a modest house, well kept, with a small garden in front that was clearly tended with attention, the kind of garden that had been planted by someone who knew what they were doing. The door was indeed green, though the paint had weathered to something closer to sage. He stood at the gate for a moment and straightened his coat, which was dusty and inadequate to the task of making him look like anything other than a man who had ridden 700 miles in 2 weeks. Then he went through the gate and knocked on the door. Mrs. Prudence Holt answered it. She was a small, tightly wound woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that assessed him in approximately 3 seconds and reached conclusions he could not entirely read. She looked at him the way a person looks at a horse they are considering buying, which was not an entirely comfortable sensation. "Mr. Brooks," she said, which was not a question. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "thank you for the letter." She let him in and sat him in the front parlor, which was a well-appointed room with more books than he had expected, filling 2 full shelves along one wall. She offered him tea, which he accepted, and she sat across from him and asked him several questions in rapid succession about his property, his financial situation, his family history, and his intentions, all delivered with the efficiency of a woman who had done this before and was not going to waste anyone's time. He answered all of them honestly. Then Mrs. Holt stood up and said she would get Jennie, and she left him sitting there with his tea in a room full of books, and Noah took a slow breath and looked at the titles on the shelves to give his hand something to do. He heard footsteps on the staircase. Not tentative footsteps, not the careful measured steps of someone descending to make a polite impression. These were the footsteps of someone who moved through the world at their own pace, confident and direct. Jennie Garrison came through the door. He had imagined her in 12 different ways over 6 weeks of letters, and she was none of those 12 things, and she was better than all of them. She was not tall, but she carried herself like she was, the kind of bearing that came from a lifetime of physical work, and the kind of confidence that came from knowing herself. Her hair was dark brown and pinned up in a practical arrangement that suggested she had put it up quickly and with no particular concern for how it looked, and a strand of it had already come loose against her cheek. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage before rain, and they were looking at him with an expression that was several things at once, cautious and curious, and something else underneath that he could not quite name yet. She was wearing a plain work dress in dark blue, clean but not dressed up, and he liked her for that immediately because it told him she had decided to let him see her as she actually was, not as she thought he wanted her to be. "Noah Brooks," she said. It was not a question, same as her aunt. "Jennie Garrison," he said. They looked at each other across the parlor for a moment, taking measure of each other the way 2 people do when they have been existing only as words on paper and now suddenly have to accommodate flesh and bone and voice and the particular way a person occupies space. Then Jennie said, "You look tired." "I rode 14 days to get here," he said. "I know," she said. "I counted." And then she sat down across from him in the chair her aunt had vacated and picked up the teacup her aunt had apparently also left for her, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes and said, "So, you read the letter?" "I did. And my aunt described me as difficult." "She did," he said, "and worth every mile." Something moved across Jennie's face then very quickly, something that was not quite a smile but was near neighbors with one. She looked down at her teacup and then back up at him. "She said that, last paragraph," he said, "second to last sentence, worth every single mile." Jennie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My aunt is occasionally too sentimental." "I found it persuasive," Noah said. She looked at him with that expression again, the layered one, and said, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone smoother," she said. "Someone who would come in here with his hat in his hand trying to look appealing." "I did come in with my hat in my hand," he pointed out. "That is literally what you do with a hat when you come inside," she said. "That is different." He laughed. He had not expected to laugh so soon, but it came out easily and naturally, and he saw something change in her expression when he did, some small relaxing of the careful assessment she had been running on him. Mrs. Holt brought more tea, and then made herself scarce with the tact of a woman who understood her role in this particular scene. Noah and Jennie talked for 2 hours in that parlor, and it was not at all like the careful getting-to-know-you conversations he had braced himself for. It was like the letters, only faster and sharper, jumping from one subject to another without apology. She told him about the books she had been reading, including a disagreement she was having with a treatise on soil cultivation that she thought was wrong about winter wheat. He told her about the horses on his ranch, and she asked very specific questions about their breeding and feeding that told him she knew what she was talking about. She told him about her father briefly and carefully, and he told her about his parents, and they sat with that shared loss for a moment without either of them trying to fix it, which was the right thing to do, and which he noticed she did instinctively. She was direct and sharp and occasionally combative, and entirely the woman he had suspected she was. She was also, and this was the thing he had not quite been prepared for, funny. Not silly, not trying to charm him, but genuinely funny, with a quick dry wit that came out of nowhere and made him feel like his brain had to move faster to keep up with her. He rode back to his boarding house that evening, which he had secured a room in before going to meet her, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the small, dusty room and thought about Jennie Garrison, and he thought, yes. He stayed in Abilene for 2 weeks. He spent part of each day with Jennie, sometimes at the house, and sometimes walking along the main street or the edge of town where the land opened up. He met her aunt's husband, a man named Gerald Holt, who was pleasant enough in a distracted way, and who clearly did not think much about either of them one way or the other, which was at least uncomplicated. He saw the bay mare Jennie had named Obstinate, who was exactly as advertised, magnificent and infuriating. He watched Jennie handle the horse, and the ease of it, the clear language between horse and rider, told him more about her than another hour of conversation could have. On the 4th day, they argued, genuinely argued about farming techniques of all things. She had a theory about how the creek drainage on his property could be improved to allow for better crop irrigation, and he thought she was not accounting for the Wyoming climate correctly, and they went back and forth about it with increasing heat until Jennie stopped mid-sentence and started laughing. "What is funny?" he said, still feeling argumentative. "We are arguing about a creek on a property I have never seen," she said, "and I find that I care quite a lot about winning." "You are not winning," he said. "I am absolutely winning," she said. "Your drainage theory ignores the spring melt entirely." He looked at her in the afternoon light, laughing and certain and completely herself, and he said, "Jennie." She stopped laughing and looked at him. "I would very much like to ask you to come back to Laramie with me," he said. "Not as a housekeeper and not as an arrangement. I want to court you properly, and if after some time you decide you want to stay, then we can talk about something permanent. But I want you to come and see the land and see how you feel about it and have the chance to know your own mind before anything is decided." Jennie looked at him for a long time without speaking, and he had the experience of being the most carefully assessed person in the territory. "You are not going to tell me the ranch needs a woman's touch," she said. "The ranch needs better creek drainage," he said, "which you are apparently an expert on." The corner of her mouth moved. "I will think about it," she said. She thought about it for 3 days. He did not push. He was not a man who pushed. He made himself available for conversation, and he continued to be himself, which was what had gotten him this far, and he trusted that it would continue to work or it would not, and he was at peace with both outcomes, or at least he told himself he was. On the 3rd evening, she found him at the livery where he had gone to check on Drum. She walked in carrying a lantern because it was past sunset, and she set the lantern on a post and said without preamble, "I want conditions." "Name them," he said. "I come as myself," she said. "Not as a woman you can shape into something more convenient. If I think you are wrong about something, I will tell you. If I think something should be done differently on the ranch, I will say so. You can disagree all you want, but you cannot tell me I don't have a right to an opinion." "You can have as many opinions as you like," he said. "I find them instructive. I am not going to promise anything about the future until I have seen the land and had time to think," she said. "That is fair." And she said, and here she paused, and he could see that this one cost her something to say, "I am not looking for someone to take care of me. I am looking for someone to stand beside me. There is a difference." "I know there is," he said. She looked at him in the lantern light, the warm glow of it catching the loose strand of hair against her cheek, and she said, "All right, I will come to Laramie." He had to resist the urge to say something foolish, and he settled for, "I am glad." "Don't be glad yet," she said. "You haven't shown me the creek drainage," he smiled. "It will hold up under scrutiny." "We will see," she said, picking up her lantern. "We will see." The preparations for departure took 4 days. Jennie had to sort through her belongings, which were not many, and say her goodbyes, and have what Noah suspected was a long conversation with her aunt, the details of which she did not share and he did not ask about. Mrs. Holt pulled him aside on the second day and said, with the expression of a woman who had done something significant and was just now seeing how it would play out, "She is stubborn as a creek stone. I meant that literally." "I know," Noah said. "And worth every mile," Mrs. Holt said with something raw and proud in her voice. "She is worth every mile," Noah nodded. "I know that too," he said. "I knew it before I got here." They left Abilene on a clear morning in late June, 1882. Jennie rode Obstinate, who the stable man at the Holt property had offered to sell to Noah for a fair price, on the grounds that the mare would be useless to anyone else, and seemed to have formed an attachment to Jennie that bordered on exclusive. Noah had agreed and paid for the horse, and Jennie had not argued about it, which told him that she had wanted Obstinate to come, and had probably hoped he would figure that out himself. The first day of riding was quiet. Not uncomfortable quiet, but the kind of quiet that exists between two people who are feeling out the space between them now that there is no parlor and no writing desk to give it structure. They rode side by side through the Kansas grass, drum's steady thud and Obstinate's shorter, sharper stride setting a rhythm. The sky was enormous out here, bigger than any ceiling. Late in the afternoon, Jennie said, "Tell me about the ranch." And Noah talked. He told her about the land, the way the eastern end was lower and wetter, better for hay than cattle. He told her about the ridge on the north side that broke the worst of the winter wind. He told her about the house, which he had built himself over 3 summers, starting with just a single room and adding to it as the ranch grew. He told her about the horses he kept, 8 of them currently, working horses mostly, though he had one mare of particular quality that he thought might be worth breeding seriously. He told her about Clyde, and she laughed at his description of the old man's principled uselessness. "You keep him because you like having someone to talk to," she said. "I kept him because I like having someone to talk to," Noah agreed. "Though I am beginning to think I have found a better solution to that particular problem." She did not respond to that immediately, but he noticed she sat a little straighter on Obstinate and looked ahead at the horizon with something in her expression that might have been quietly pleased. They traveled north and west, following routes that were well established by 1882, post roads and trails that cut through the grassland with the confidence of paths that had been walked into permanence. They passed through small towns where Noah knew some of the way station keepers, and they spent several nights in boarding houses when they were available. When they were not available, they made camp, and Jennie was as competent at this as at everything else, setting up without fuss and taking her watch at the fire seriously. The third night out from Abilene, they made camp near a creek in central Kansas, and after supper was done and the horses were settled, they sat by the fire and Jennie said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "Why did you come?" she said. "Really, you had the ranch, you had your life arranged. You could have written back to my aunt and said it was not a good time, and that would have been the end of it. Why did you actually come?" Noah looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "Because of what your aunt wrote at the end of the letter, not just the part about worth every mile. Before that." He paused. "She wrote that you were honest even when it cost you. She wrote that you held to your moral sense even when it was hard. And I thought about the last few years of my life, working the ranch alone, and I thought about the kind of person I had built that ranch for in my head all that time, the person I imagined sharing it with, and the description your aunt wrote fit that person exactly. Not her looks, not her domestic skills, the fact that she was someone who chose to be good even when it was hard." Jennie was very still on her side of the fire. "That is why I came," he said. She looked at him across the fire, and her expression was the kind that a person doesn't quite control, too much feeling in it for careful management. Then she looked back down at her hands and said quietly, "That is possibly the most honest thing anyone has said to me in a long time." "I tend toward honesty," he said. "It's less work than the alternative." She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then she said, "Good, me too." They rode into Wyoming on a bright, hot July day, and Noah watched Jennie take in the change in landscape with the attention of a person who is calculating something. The mountains in the distance changed the proportion of everything, the sky pulling back up to its proper height, the land below it correspondingly vast and complex, folded and ridged in ways that Kansas flatness had not prepared for. "It is different than I imagined," she said. "Better or worse?" She thought about this for a genuine moment, not just being polite. "Neither," she said. "Different. It feels older." "The mountains are old," he agreed. "I like it," she said, which was delivered in the tone of someone making a neutral factual statement, but which landed in Noah's chest like something considerably more than that. They reached the Pinto Creek Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, 17 days after leaving Abilene. Clyde was sitting on the porch when they rode in, as though he had been placed there specifically for the purpose of providing welcome, though knowing Clyde he had been sitting there most of the afternoon because it was sunny and he had nothing more pressing to do. He looked at Jennie with bright, assessing eyes, and then at Noah with an expression that said several things at once and out loud said only, "You found her, then?" "I found her," Noah said. Jennie swung down from obstinate with the ease of a long-time rider and said to Clyde, "You must be the man who is more useful for conversation than for cattle." Clyde blinked and then broke into a grin that showed he had kept most of his teeth. "He told you that. He wrote it," she said, "in a letter, before he had even met me." Clyde looked at Noah with a different kind of expression now, something between astonishment and delight. "He wrote that to a woman he was trying to impress." "I was not trying to impress her," Noah said. "I was trying to be honest." "Same thing, apparently," Jennie said, and she took obstinate's reins and looked at Noah and said, "Show me the barn. I want to see how you keep your horses." Clyde watched them walk toward the barn, and when they were far enough away, he said quietly to nobody in particular, "Well, she is something." The first weeks on the ranch were a kind of careful negotiation, two people learning to exist in the same space without getting in each other's way, which was harder than it sounded when both of them had strong opinions about how things should be done. Jennie had moved into the guest room in Noah's house, which was entirely proper, with Mrs. Holt having received a letter from Noah assuring her of the arrangements before departure. There was no impropriety. There was also a fair amount of barely suppressed electricity in the air whenever they were in the same room, which both of them were too sensible to act on yet. Jennie was up at dawn every day, which he had expected, and she was in the barn before he was, which he had not. She had opinions about the feeding schedule for the horses, and she turned out to be correct, and he adjusted it and said so, which made her look at him with something like surprised respect. She walked every inch of the creek drainage the second day she was there, and came back at supper with a detailed plan for how to improve it that was so thoroughly thought through that he could not find a single hole in the argument. "You were right," he said, "about the spring melt." "I know," she said, without any unnecessary celebration about it. "I usually am about things I have thought carefully about." "Does it bother you," he said, "when people don't listen?" She considered this. "It used to make me furious," she said. "Now it mostly just makes me patient. I have learned that I can be right for as long as it takes." "That is a useful quality," he said. "It is an exhausting quality," she said, "but it works." There was a morning in the third week when Noah came into the barn early and found Jennie sitting in the straw next to one of the older mares who had been off her feed for 2 days. The mare was leaning her head against Jennie's shoulder, and Jennie was talking to the horse quietly, not commands but a kind of low, steady murmur. Noah stood at the barn door and watched for a moment, feeling something settle into his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a creek, slow and sure and final. He had known since the letter. He knew it more certainly now. He did not say anything then. The moment was not his to interrupt. He got his coffee from the house and went out to check the fence line, giving her the morning. The creek drainage project became a shared enterprise that took up most of July. Jennie had surveyed the water flow and mapped it out with rocks and sticks, and they worked on the channels together, digging and redirecting with the teamwork of two people who had found a working language. The physical labor of it was satisfying in a particular way, the kind of work that had visible results at the end of each day, and Jennie worked with focused attention, getting herself thoroughly muddy without comment. On a particularly hot afternoon in late July, when they had been digging in the creek bed for several hours and the sun was directly overhead, Jennie straightened up and pushed the loose strand of hair back from her face, which was dusty and flushed and entirely unconcerned with presentation, and she said, "My father would have liked this ranch." Noah set down his shovel. "Tell me about him." She did. She talked about her father for almost an hour, standing in the creek bed with muddy boots, talking about a man who had believed that working the land was a form of conversation with it, that farming was not about imposing yourself on the soil, but about listening to what it needed. She talked about the way he had taught her to read weather and to read plants and to read horses. She talked about his humor, which had been quiet and constant, the kind of humor that made everything a little more bearable. Her voice was steady most of the way through and tight at the end, and Noah listened to all of it without trying to make it better, because some things don't get better, they just get carried. When she was done, she picked up her shovel again and said, "Right, where were we?" "Third channel," he said, picking up his own shovel. "Third channel," she agreed. They worked until the lights started to go golden and then walked back to the house together, both of them filthy and tired in the good way. At the door of the house, Jennie paused and said, "Thank you for listening." "Thank you for telling me," he said. She looked at him for a moment in that layered way she had, and then she went inside. Noah stood on the porch for a minute looking at the mountains in the last of the light, and he thought, if she decides to leave, it will be the second hardest thing I have survived. And then he went inside. In August, there was a situation. It involved a man named Wade Colton, who had a cattle operation about 15 miles south of the Pinto Creek Ranch, and who had been, before Noah had quite understood what was happening, operating under the impression that some of the land along the southern edge of Noah's property was actually unregistered and therefore fair game for expansion. Wade Colton was not a violent man, but he was a persistent one, and he arrived at the ranch on a hot August morning with two of his hands and a version of recent survey history that did not match Noah's land documents. He was also, Noah noticed with irritation, quite obviously making an assessment of Jennie, who had been in the yard working on Obstinate's shoes when the men rode in. Jennie set down her hoof pick and straightened up and looked at the three riders with the expression of someone who had seen this particular kind of situation before and was already forming an opinion about how to handle it. Wade Colton was around 40, broad across the shoulders, with the confident bearing of a man who was accustomed to having more than his neighbors. He nodded at Jennie with a kind of proprietary pleasantness that Noah did not like at all, and then addressed Noah about the land question. Noah kept his voice level and his point clear. The land was registered and documented. He had the papers inside. He was happy to show them. The southern fence line had been placed by survey and he would not be moving it. Colton pressed the issue in several different ways, some reasonable and some less so. At a certain point he said, with a sideways look at Jennie, "I am surprised a man in your situation wants to make an enemy over a few hundred acres that he is probably too stretched to work anyway." Noah opened his mouth, but Jennie spoke first. "His situation is a registered and documented property with a clear survey boundary," she said, in the kind of voice that teachers and reverends use when they are making a point very carefully. "And if you would like to see the survey documents, we can get them right now. But the fence line is not moving, Mr. Colton, and I think you already know that. I think you came here hoping that a question would leave enough uncertainty to act on, and I want to tell you plainly that there is no uncertainty here." Colton looked at her with an expression that cycled through surprised, annoyed, and something calculating, and then he said, "And who exactly are you, ma'am?" "I am someone who has read every document relating to this property," she said, "and who would be happy to take any disputed survey question to the county registrar in Laramie, where the documents are filed, and where the answer will be exactly what I just told you." There was a silence. Then Colton turned back to Noah and said, "You want to discuss this like reasonable men. "I believe the matter has been covered," Noah said. Colton held his gaze for another moment, then touched his hat brim, which was not so much politeness as it was a way of taking back some ground, and said to his men, "Let's go." They rode out without the casual menace they had ridden in with. When they were gone, Noah looked at Jennie, who was already picking up her hoof pick. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, going back to work on Obstinate's shoe. "But I am very glad you did," he said. She looked up at him briefly. "So am I," she said. He had the look of a man who tests what he can get away with. I wanted to be clear about what he could get away with, which is nothing. Noah leaned against the fence post and looked at her with the particular feeling that had been growing in him since he had read the first letter, and which had by now become something he could not contain in any useful term except the obvious one. He was in love with Jennie Garrison. He had possibly been in love with her before he met her, which seemed irrational but which the evidence supported. He was entirely, thoroughly in love with her, and the question of what to do about that was becoming increasingly urgent. He did not say any of this in that moment. Instead he said, "I will get those survey papers filed with an additional copy at the Laramie County office, just in case." "Good idea," she said, and went back to the horse. The evening of the same day, after supper, they were sitting on the porch in the last of the light, and Jennie said, "I have been thinking." "About the land dispute," he said. "About staying," she said. He was very careful about his expression. "What about staying?" he said. "I came here with conditions," she said, "and all of the conditions have been met. You have not tried to make me into something different. You have not dismissed my opinions. You have given me space to figure out how I feel about this place and about—" She paused. "About all of it. And," he said. She looked out at the mountains, which in the evening light were purple and enormous and eternal. "I like this land," she said. "I like the work of it. I like that it is hard and honest and that it responds to attention." "It does," he said. "And I like—" She stopped again, and this time the pause was longer, and she was choosing her words with the care of a person who does not say things they don't mean. "I like being here," she said. "With you." Noah turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and the Wyoming evening was all around them with its enormous sky and its pine-scented air and the distant sound of the creek, and he said, "Jennie, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to know that I am not saying it to create pressure or expectation, only because it is true." "All right," she said. "I love you," he said. "I believe I have been falling in love with you since the letter, but I know it for certain now, and I think you should know it because you are a person who values honesty, and it would not be honest to sit here next to you and not say it." Jennie looked at him for a long time. Her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it, stripped of the careful layers she usually maintained, and what was underneath was something real and complicated and warm. "I am not easy to love," she said. "I know," he said. "I like that about you." Something shifted in her face, a final loosening of whatever she had been holding. "I know," she said quietly. "I can tell that you do." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and they sat like that for a while as the light faded over the mountains, and it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened in a long time to either of them. After a moment she said, "I love you too. I have been trying not to say it too soon because I know what I am like when I decide something, and I didn't want to decide too fast." "How long have you known?" he said. She considered this. "The night you told me why you came," she said. "By the fire. When you said it was because I was someone who chose to be good even when it was hard." She paused. "No one had ever said anything like that to me before. Most people just told me I was difficult." "You are difficult," he said. "I know," she said, "but you said it like it was beside the point." "It is beside the point," he said. She tightened her hand on his, and they watched the last of the light leave the mountains. In September, Noah rode into Laramie and visited the office of the county judge, a man named Harmon who had known Noah since the early years of the ranch. He discussed what was required for a formal engagement and a subsequent marriage, and he came back to the ranch with the relevant information, and with a small package from the general store that he kept in his coat pocket. He had been thinking about how to do this. He was not a man given to elaborate ceremony, but he wanted to do it right, to match the moment to what he felt, and he thought that for Jennie, right would mean honest and simple. He found her at the creek, as he often found her in the evenings, sitting on the flat rock above the third channel they had dug together, watching the water run the improved course. She had a book in her hand, one she had borrowed from a neighbor, and her boots were off on the rock beside her and her feet were in the water. He sat down next to her on the rock, and she looked up from her book, and then at him with the expression that meant she was reading something. "What?" She said. "I have a question," he said. She set the book down on her knee and looked at him properly. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the small package, and he opened it, and inside was a ring, plain gold, not ornate, because ornate would have been wrong for her and he had known that. He held it and looked at her and said, "Jennie Garrison, I would very much like to marry you. Not because you would be useful to the ranch, and not because it is the next logical step in any arrangement, but because I want to spend the rest of my life in conversation with you. I want to argue about creek drainage and farm theory and books we are reading. I want you to be right about things and tell me so. I want to watch you with the horses every morning. I want to know you for the next 40 years and find out what else there is to find out." Jennie looked at the ring and then at him, and her gray-green eyes were very bright, the way water is bright when the sun hits it right. "That," she said, "is the most honest proposal I have ever received." "It is the only proposal I have ever made," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, that is the only one, or yes, you will marry me." "Both," she said. "Both are yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then she leaned over and kissed him, her hand coming up to his jaw, steady and sure, and it was not tentative or careful but real, the way everything she did was real, fully committed, nothing held back. When she pulled back, she said, "You should know that I am going to keep arguing with you about things." "I counted on it," he said, "and I am going to change things on the ranch when I think they need changing." "I counted on that too." She looked at the ring again, turning her hand slightly in the evening light. "Noah, yes. I am glad you read the letter," she said. "I am glad your aunt wrote it," he said. "She is going to say I told you so," Jennie said. "She deserves to," he said. They were married in October of 1882 in Laramie at the courthouse, with Judge Harmon officiating and Clyde standing up as Noah's witness, looking extremely pleased with himself for reasons that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the fact that he was the kind of old man who felt vicarious joy in other people's good fortune. Mrs. Prudence Holt made the trip from Abilene for the ceremony, arriving 2 days before and immediately commandeering the kitchen of the boarding house, where she was staying to produce enough food for a small celebration afterward, which she organized with the efficiency of a military general and the sentiment of a woman who had been worrying about her niece for a very long time. Gerald Holt had not come, citing business, which Jennie had accepted with the equanimity of someone who had not expected much from that quarter anyway. But Mrs. Holt had embraced her niece on the porch of the boarding house the morning of the wedding and held on for a long time, and Jennie had held on back, and whatever was exchanged between them in that moment was private and sufficient. Jennie wore a dress she had made herself, navy blue, good wool, practical enough to be worn again, but fine enough to be a wedding dress, which was exactly the kind of choice she made about everything. She wore her hair properly pinned for the occasion, but with, Noah noticed, the same strand loose against her cheek that was always there. He chose to believe that she had done it on purpose. He had worn his best suit, which was clean and properly fitted and not particularly impressive. But Jennie had looked at him when they stood together before Judge Harmon, and she had looked at him as though he was the most impressive thing she had ever seen, which undid him more thoroughly than any amount of formal ceremony could have. Judge Harmon read the words and they said the words back, and Clyde produced a handkerchief from somewhere and used it, and Mrs. Holt kept herself together until Jennie said, "I do," and then did not, and it was a very good afternoon. The celebration afterward at the boarding house was simple and lively, attended by Clyde and the Holts and several neighbors who had heard about it, and showed up with good intentions and appetite. Someone produced a fiddle. Noah was not a dancing man, but he danced once, badly, with Jennie, who was also not particularly a dancing woman but who danced with him anyway, laughing at his footwork and correcting it with the confidence of someone correcting a bad fence line. Later that evening, when the celebration had wound down and the guests had drifted back to where they had come from, Noah and Jennie stood on the porch of the boarding house in the October air, which was cool and clean with the smell of coming autumn in it. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, quietly trying it out. She tilted her head slightly, considering it. "I will keep Garrison professionally," she said, "for correspondence and such, but Mrs. Brooks is not terrible." "High praise," he said. "I am not a woman who overstates things," she said. "No," he agreed, "you are not." They rode back to the Pinto Creek Ranch the next morning, side by side as they had ridden from Abilene, drum and obstinate at their usual rhythms. The October hills were beginning to turn, the aspens going gold along the creeks and ridgelines, and the sky was the deep blue of high-altitude autumn that was different from any other blue in the world. Jennie rode with her face turned up to the light, and Noah watched her for a moment when she wasn't looking. This woman who had been described in a letter and had arrived in his life like weather, the kind that changes everything. "Stop looking at me," she said, without turning her head. "How did you know I was looking at you?" "I always know," she said. "You get a particular kind of quiet," he laughed. "I will have to be more subtle." "Don't bother," she said, and now she turned and looked at him, and she was smiling fully and without reservation, the smile her aunt had said could fill a room back up again after the temper had cleared it. It could. It definitely could. "I like it," she said, "the particular kind of quiet." The first winter on the Pinto Creek Ranch as a married couple was hard in the way that Wyoming winters were always hard, which was unapologetically. The snow came in November and stayed, and the temperatures went low enough that the creek froze at the edges, and the horses needed extra feeding, and the firewood supply that Noah had laid in over the autumn proved to be exactly sufficient with nothing to spare. They were indoors together a great deal, which was either going to prove them right about each other or badly wrong. It proved them right. They spent the long evenings reading, often the same book in rotation, arguing about it at meals. Jennie had gotten hold of several volumes at the Laramie General Store before the serious cold settled in, including a book on irrigation techniques that she read with the focused intensity of a student preparing for examination, and then spent 3 evenings explaining to Noah in detail, drawing diagrams on the back of the brown paper the dry goods had been wrapped in. He paid attention. He always paid attention to her. She developed a system for tracking the horse's health through the winter that was more thorough than what he had been doing, and the horses came through the winter in better condition than they had the previous years. He told her so, directly and specifically, and she nodded with the expression of someone who had expected to be right, but was still glad to have it confirmed. Clyde came for supper twice a week, which was how it had always been, and which Jennie adopted without question, setting a third place at the table as naturally as if it had always been there. She and Clyde had developed a friendship that Noah found both amusing and entirely right, 2 people who appreciated directness and had found in each other a reliable source of it. Clyde told her stories about the early years of the ranch, the harder years before it had found its footing, and Jennie listened with the full attention she gave to things she found important. One evening in February, Clyde said to Noah while Jennie was at the stove getting more coffee, "You did well, boy." Noah said, "I know." "I mean it," Clyde said. "I have known you a long time. You were good at being alone. Some men are, and it's easier. You are better at being with her." Noah looked at Jennie at the stove, her back to them, talking to herself slightly as she always did when she was thinking about something, and he thought that this was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about him. "I am," he agreed, "considerably better." In the spring of 1883, The creek drainage project that Jennie had designed showed its full value for the first time, directing the spring melt water efficiently through the channels they had dug and into the hay fields in a way that produced the best grass growth Noah had seen on those fields since he had owned them. Jennie walked the fields in April with an expression of measured satisfaction that was her version of triumph. "I told you about the spring melt," she said. "You did," he said. "You were absolutely right." "I know," she said, and then she smiled at him sideways, and then she laughed because she could not entirely maintain the dignified correctness in the face of how much she was enjoying this, and he loved her for that, for the way the laughter was always close underneath the certainty. They also expanded the horses. The mare of particular quality that Noah had mentioned to Jennie in one of his early letters had produced a colt that winter that was, by consensus, exceptional. Deep-chested, clean-legged, with the kind of movement that made experienced horsemen stop and look. Jennie had been present for the foaling and had named the colt Creek. On account of the drainage project she was willing to take partial credit for, and she managed his early handling with the skill and patience that she brought to every animal. She also discovered, in the spring of 1883, that she was expecting their first child. She told Noah on a morning when they were both in the barn, in the same straightforward way she told him everything. He had looked at her for a moment with every feeling he had running through him at once, and then he had crossed the barn and held her, and she had let him, her arms coming up around him and her face against his shoulder, and she had said very quietly, "I am happy about it." "So am I," he said, "more than I can say." "You don't have to say it," she said. "I can feel the particular kind of quiet." He pressed his face against her hair and laughed quietly and held her tighter. She was magnificently pregnant and would not hear of reducing her work, which led to the first serious argument of their marriage that was not about agricultural theory. Noah had suggested, very carefully and with full awareness that he was doing something dangerous, that she might consider doing slightly less physical work in the later months of the pregnancy. Jennie had looked at him with an expression he had not previously seen, one that combined genuine irritation with a kind of patience that suggested she had been expecting this conversation. "Noah," she said, "I understand that you are worried. I am not going to do anything that puts this baby at risk. But I am a healthy woman who has worked hard her entire life, and my body knows what it is doing. If I sit in a chair in the kitchen for the next 4 months, I will become someone you do not want to be married to." He had thought about this. Then he said, "Will you at least tell me if something feels wrong?" "Immediately," she said. "And will you let me carry the heavier things?" She considered this as a genuine negotiation. "Some of them," she said. "Some of them," he agreed. He wrote to Mrs. Holt. He felt she should know. And also he suspected Jennie had not told her yet because Jennie had a habit of waiting until she was certain about things before announcing them. Mrs. Holt wrote back within the week with an effusive letter that was primarily made up of advice, some of it practical and some of it the kind of advice that had been passed from women to women for generations, and also contained the line, "I told you so." Not to you, Mr. Brooks, to myself. Every day since I sent that letter. Noah showed Jennie that line. She read it and shook her head and said, "She is impossible." And then she read it again and her eyes went bright and she said, "I should write to her." "You should," he said. She did, and Noah did not know what the letter contained, but he heard her laugh twice while she was writing it. Their son was born in November of 1883, a Tuesday, which Noah had begun to associate with significant events in his life. The birth was attended by the doctor from Laramie, who had come out to the ranch the previous week and had made the arrangements to stay nearby when the time came, and by Mrs. Holt, who had arrived in October and had made herself indispensable in the 2 weeks before the birth, and who was going to stay through December, a plan Gerald Holt apparently had strong feelings about, but which Mrs. Holt had apparently not made room for in her schedule. Noah spent the hours of the labor in a state of controlled anxiety that Clyde, who was also at the ranch, managed to slightly reduce by talking to him about completely irrelevant things until Noah wanted to either strangle him or thank him, and mostly settled, ungrateful. The boy was healthy. He arrived with the kind of announcement that left no doubt about his presence in the world, and when the doctor brought him out and put him in Noah's arms and Noah looked down at him, the child looked back with the unfocused and furious attention of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is taking stock of it. "He looks like you," Mrs. Holt said, appearing at his elbow. "He looks like he is about to have an opinion about something," Noah said. Mrs. Holt laughed. "I told Jennie. She said that was your fault." Jennie, when he came to her with the boy, was tired in the particular way of someone who has just done something enormous, and she looked at the child in his arms with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her, all the walls entirely down. "Give him to me," she said. He put their son in her arms and sat beside her on the bed, and they both looked at the baby, who had settled his furious attention on his mother and appeared to be conducting his initial survey. "What shall we call him?" Noah said. "I have been thinking about that," she said, which he knew meant she had made a decision several weeks ago and was now presenting it. "Thomas, for my father." He looked at her. "Thomas Brooks," he said. "Thomas Garrison Brooks," she said, "if that is all right." "It is more than all right," he said. "It is exactly right." She looked at him with the strand of hair loose against her cheek and the baby in her arms and the lamplight in the room, and she said, "Noah." "Yes. I love you," she said. "I do not say it often enough." "You say it enough," he said. "No," she said. "I don't. I know I don't. I think it constantly, and I do not always say it because I was raised to be cautious with the important things." She looked down at Thomas, who had closed his eyes with the decisiveness of a person who had seen enough for now. "I am going to try to say it more. You have just had our son," he said. "You are not required to also reform your communication habits on the same day." She laughed, tired and full of feeling, and leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her carefully, around both of them, and sat there in the lamplight with his wife and his son, and the Wyoming November outside the window, and felt the specific, enormous, ordinary gravity of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Thomas Garrison Brooks was a healthy and determined child who grew into a healthy and determined small person, which surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He was walking before he was a year old and talking not long after, and his very first use of complete sentences was, at 14 months, to disagree with something his mother had told him, which caused Jennie to put her hands on her hips and look at him and say, "You sound exactly like your father." Noah was fully aware that this was not accurate and also fully aware that contesting it would not improve his situation, so he said, "He is going to be wonderful." Jennie looked at him with one of those expressions that said several things at once, and then looked back at Thomas, who was still disagreeing about whatever had started the discussion, and said, "He is already wonderful. That doesn't mean I am not going to argue with him about it." Thomas grew up on the ranch in the way that children raised on working land grow up, which is thoroughly and practically, learning early what work was and where food came from, and what the weather meant and how animals behaved. He was around horses from birth and on them by the time he was 3, sitting in front of Jennie on Obstinate, who was old now but still magnificent, and who accepted the child on her back with the air of a horse who had made a specific exception. By the spring of 1885, the Pinto Creek Ranch had grown considerably. The creek drainage improvements had made the hay fields substantially more productive, and Noah had expanded the horse operation based on the success of Creek, the exceptional colt from 1883, who had grown into an exceptional stallion, and whose offspring were in demand from ranchers and horsemen throughout Wyoming territory. Jennie had taken over the management of the breeding records with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and the organization of it made Noah's earlier system look like what it had been, which was well-intentioned but insufficiently rigorous. They had also hired 2 ranch hands in addition to Clyde, young men from the Laramie area named Felipe Reyes and James Whitmore, who had both come in answer to a notice Noah had posted at the general store. Felipe was 22 and from a Mexican family that had been in the territory for 2 generations, a horseman of considerable natural ability who was honest and hardworking, and who Jennie had approved with the directness she brought to all personnel decisions. He knows what he is doing with horses and he doesn't talk too much. Hire him. James was 23 and from Missouri originally, less experienced but willing to learn, and Jennie had approved him on the basis that he had asked good questions in the interview and had not talked over her when she was speaking, which she noted was a better quality than most candidates displayed. The ranch house had been expanded by then as well. Noah had added 2 more rooms the summer after Thomas was born, because the original structure, built for a single man, had been increasingly inadequate, and there was a 3rd room under construction in the spring of 1885 because Jennie had told him in March, in the same straightforward way she told him everything, that Thomas was going to need somewhere to put a sibling. He had looked at her across the breakfast table with the same feeling he had had the first time, warm and sure and slightly reckless, and he had said, "When?" "October," she said. "Possibly September, depending on certain calculations that I am 90% confident about. And the other 10%. "October," she said. It was late September as it turned out, and it was a girl this time, which Thomas received with the 2-year-old's mixture of fascination and suspicion. They called her Rose, which was Jennie's idea, because the roses in the front garden that she had planted the 2nd spring on the ranch had been the first thing she had grown from scratch there, the first thing she had chosen and put in the ground and watched come up, and she said it seemed right to name something new and living for the first new and living thing she had made in this place. Noah found this beautiful, as he found most of what Jennie said beautiful when she was willing to say the real thing underneath the practical thing. He told her so. She said, "You are becoming sentimental in your old age." "I am 34, he said. "That is old enough for sentiment to be a risk," she said, and then she smiled at him over baby Rose's head, and he thought, "Yes, this is exactly the life I wanted when I could not have named what I wanted." Clyde was there for Rose's birth as he had been for Thomas's, and he held the baby afterward with the careful attention of an old man who knows that small things are easily damaged and also knows that they are the most important things there are. He looked at Rose for a long time and then at Noah and said, "You built a good thing, boy." "I had help," Noah said. Clyde snorted. "You had more than help," he said. "You had the right person." In the summer of 1886, Clyde's health began to decline, which was the nature of things for a man of 75 who had spent his entire life outdoors in hard country. He did not decline dramatically but steadily, the way old things do when they are winding down with dignity. He continued to come for supper twice a week, and continued to be present on the ranch in the ways that mattered, which were the conversational and the observational ways more than the physical. He told Thomas stories that Noah knew were not entirely factually accurate, but were entirely accurate in spirit, and Thomas received them with the open-mouthed attention of a child who is being given something important. Jennie made sure that Clyde had everything he needed at his small house on the property's edge, which he had been occupying for years, and she checked on him with the undemonstrative regularity of someone who had decided that a person she cared about was going to be properly looked after, whether or not he asked to be. Clyde received this with the grace of a man who had been alone long enough to know what it meant to have someone notice. He passed in the autumn of 1886, in his sleep, which was right and peaceful, and Noah buried him on the low rise at the east edge of the property where the creek was visible, because Clyde had told him once years ago that if he died before seeing something good come to Noah's life, he would at least want to be buried somewhere with a view worth looking at. There was already plenty to look at from that rise. The creek ran clear and well-directed through the channels he and Jennie had built together. The hay fields were full. The horse pasture held 12 animals now, horses of quality and temperament that spoke to the care they had been raised with. The house was larger and lit up in the evenings, with the sounds of Thomas and Rose and the kind of ordinary daily life that had once been a chair no one was sitting in. Noah stood at the grave for a while after, and Jennie stood beside him with her hand in his, and Thomas stood between them holding Rose's hand because Rose was 2 and could not be trusted to stay still without a tether. "He was a good man," Jennie said. "He was," Noah said. "He told me to go get you." She looked at him. "He did." "Before he had ever met you," Noah said. "After I told him about the letters, he said I ought to go and get you before someone else did." Jennie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was a very wise man." "He was right about most things," Noah agreed. "Even the things he claimed to be useless at." They stood there a while longer, and the creek ran below them, and the sky was the autumn blue that held the cold inside it even when the sun was still warm. The years that followed were full years, which is the best thing years can be. Thomas grew into a boy of 7, who could ride anything in the horse pasture, and who had his mother's habit of asking questions, until he understood the answer, and his father's habit of sitting quietly and paying attention when something required it. Rose at 4 was a different kind of person entirely, more inclined toward the garden than the barn, with a precise interest in growing things that was entirely her own, and that Jennie encouraged with the specific enthusiasm of someone watching something develop on its own terms rather than the terms she would have chosen. Felipe Reyes became, over the years, less a hired hand and more a true partner in the running of the ranch, a man whose instincts with horses matched and sometimes exceeded Noah's own, and whose family background in the territory gave him a knowledge of the land and its seasons that was invaluable. He married a woman named Alina in 1887, and they built a small house on the northeast corner of the property with Noah and Jennie's full support. And Alina was quiet and very funny and became one of Jennie's few genuine friends, a woman who could keep up with her in conversation and was not afraid to disagree. James Whitmore had left the ranch in 1886 and moved further west, which was the nature of some people, and Noah had replaced him with a younger man named George, who was steady and willing and would probably be at the Pinto Creek Ranch for the rest of his working life. In the spring of 1888, when Thomas was 4 and Rose was 2, and there was a third baby on the way, a situation arose in the territory that was larger than the ranch and harder to ignore. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association had been consolidating power for years, using their influence over territorial law to protect the interests of the large cattle operations at the expense of smaller ranchers and settlers. The tensions between the big operations and the smaller landowners had been building since Noah had arrived in Wyoming, and in 1888 they were reaching a point that felt genuinely dangerous. Noah had never been a political man, but he was a just one, and he had watched the association's increasing control over access to water rights and grazing land with the specific concern of someone who owned land they intended to keep. He attended a meeting of the smaller ranchers in Laramie in the spring of 1888, and he came back from that meeting with a clear sense of what was at stake and a clear sense of what he intended to do about it. Jennie had been waiting for him on the porch, which she did not often do, which told him she had been thinking about this too. "What happened?" she said. He told her. He told her what the large operations were doing, the systematic pressure they were applying to smaller ranchers through control of the stockgrowers' registration, the threats that had been made to ranchers who did not cooperate with the association's pricing structures, the broader pattern of a few powerful men trying to use institutional leverage to push smaller operations out. Jennie listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her gray-green eyes going darker as he talked. "And what are you going to do?" She said when he was finished. "I am going to stand with the other small ranchers," he said. "We are going to organize and file documentation of the abuses with the territorial government, and we are going to make sure what they are doing is on the record." "Good," she said. "It might make us unpopular with certain people," he said. I'm not particularly interested in being popular with people who use power to harm others, she said. You know that. I know it, he said. I wanted you to know what we might be walking into. She looked at him with the full directness that was her particular gift and said, Noah, I told you when I agreed to come here that I was looking for someone to stand beside me. That runs both ways. He looked at her in the spring evening light, this woman who had walked out of a letter and into his life and become the most important thing in it, and he said, I know it does. I count on it. She uncrossed her arms and took his hand. Then let's figure out what we can do. What they could do was considerable, as it turned out, because Jennie had a clear mind for organization and documentation, and no fear of putting her name on things. And Noah had the respect of his neighboring ranchers and the kind of reputation that came from years of honest dealing. They worked through the late spring and summer of 1888 helping to gather and organize the documentation that eventually went to the territorial governor's office. And while the larger conflict between the small ranchers and the big cattle operation would not be fully resolved in those years, and would in fact boil into more serious confrontation in the early 1890s, the smaller ranchers in their region had at least built the organizational foundation to resist being picked off one by one. Noah stayed out of the worst of what came later, because by the time it escalated, he and Jennie had made specific choices about what they were willing to do and what they were not, and those choices were consistent with who they were. They were not going to be pushed off their land, but they were also not going to be pulled into something violent. They stood where they stood, documented what they documented, and came through the period with their land and their integrity intact. Their third child, another boy, was born in September of 1888. They named him Joseph, which was Noah's father's name, and he arrived with considerably more ease than either Thomas or Rose had, a practical child from the start, as though he had decided that unnecessary drama was not worth anyone's time. Thomas received Joseph with the serious proprietary concern of an older brother. Rose received him with the polite interest of a gardener noticing a new plant and mentally deciding where it fit in the overall design. Noah held all three of his children in the same lamplight of the same room where he had first held Thomas, and each time he thought, "This is the life I could not have named wanting, and it is the life I have." Jennie, recovered from Joseph's birth and sitting up in the bed with her dark hair down and her gray-green eyes clear and steady, said, "3 is enough, I think." "I think so too," he said. "Though I said that after Thomas," she said with a specific sideways look. "And after Rose," he added. "Yes, well," she said. "Apparently my thinking requires revision after the fact." He sat on the edge of the bed and handed Joseph back to her, and she settled the baby and looked at Noah with that expression, the unguarded one, the one that was all the layers removed. "Are you happy?" she said. He had thought about this. Not whether he was, but how to say it in a way that matched what he felt, because he was not, as she had once told him, a man who overstated things either. "I am happier than I knew a person could be and still be living their ordinary life," he said. "I expected happiness to be dramatic. I thought it would feel like an event. But this is the happiest I have ever been, and it is just Tuesday." Jennie looked at him for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "It is a Tuesday." He looked at her. "You first read the letter on a Tuesday," she said. "You told me that in one of the early letters." He had forgotten he had told her that. He looked at her in the lamplight, this woman who remembered everything, who had read every word he had ever sent her and held on to it, and he said, "I remember." "So did I," she said. They looked at each other, with Joseph sleeping between them and the Wyoming autumn outside the window and the creek running somewhere in the dark, directed and clear and useful, through the channels they had built together with their hands. The years continued to be good. They were not without their difficulties, because no life worth having is without difficulty, but they were good in the way that matters, in the way of people who have found the right place and the right person, and have built something real from both. Thomas grew into a young man of unusual quality, inheriting his mother's directness and his father's patience in a combination that made him, by the time he was 15, someone the neighboring ranchers trusted with horses and with information. He would take over the primary management of the horse operation eventually, and this was something that was understood between all of them without anyone having to say it directly. Rose grew into a young woman who was profoundly interested in the natural world in a way that extended beyond gardening, who read everything she could find about plants and botany and the broader science of growing things, and who had an argument with a traveling professor passing through Laramie when she was 12 that Jennie recounted to Noah afterward with the proud expression she reserved for moments when she recognized herself in her daughter. Joseph was the steady one, the one who watched more than he spoke and who understood situations with a clarity that was entirely his own, and who grew up to be a person that everyone relied on without necessarily being able to explain why, only knowing that when Joseph was there, things worked out. Elena Reyes had 2 children of her own by the mid-1890s, and the children of the ranch grew up in each other's company, which was good for all of them. The ranch was a community in the way that places become communities when they are built with intention and sustained with care. In the late summer of 1892, Noah rode out to the rise where he had buried Clyde and stood there in the evening light. He did this occasionally, not out of grief, which had softened into something more like gratitude over the years, but out of the habit of a man who likes to take stock of things from a vantage point that gives perspective. He could see the whole ranch from here. The house with its additions, the warm light in the windows, the barn where Thomas was probably still with the horses, because Thomas was always still with the horses. The garden, which was Rose's domain entirely by now, laid out with the same careful precision she brought to everything. The hay fields, green and well-watered through channels that had been rethought twice in 10 years and were now as efficient as anything in the territory. He heard footsteps behind him and knew them without turning. Jennie came and stood beside him, the way she always did, her shoulder against his arm. "I thought you were inside," he said. "I was," she said. "Then I looked out the window and saw where you were, so I came." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the easy, familiar weight of 10 years of being alongside each other. "What are you thinking about?" she said. "Your aunt's letter," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "After all this time." "I think about it sometimes," he said. "Not the whole letter, just the last part, worth every mile." Jennie looked out over the ranch, the fields and the barn and the house with its lamplight, the horses visible in the pasture. She was quiet for a long time with the kind of quiet that had content in it. Then she said she was not wrong. "No," he said, "she was not wrong." "Difficult," Jennie said, with a dry tone that was also underneath something more. "And worth every mile." "Every single mile," he said. "I would ride it again." She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and they were both older and both worn in the ways that good hard years wear a person, marked by weather and work, and the particular kind of time that goes into building something real. And she was exactly as beautiful to him as she had been on the first afternoon in her aunt's parlor, more so, because now he knew everything that was behind the gray-green eyes, all of it, the stubborn intelligence and the quick laugh and the deep loyalty, and the way she could clear a room and fill it back up again, and the way she held on to what mattered and let go of what didn't, and the specific, irreplaceable way she was herself, all the way through. He kissed her on the rise above the creek, with the Wyoming evening coming in around them and the lamplight of their house below them, and she kissed him back with everything she had, the way she did everything, fully committed, nothing held back. When they pulled apart, she said, "We should go in. Thomas will be in the barn until someone tells him supper is ready." "Yes," he said. "And Rose will have rearranged something in the kitchen while I was out here," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "And Joseph is at the table with his book and will not have noticed what time it is. He never does." She took his hand and they turned back toward the house, toward the light and the sound of their children, and the life they had made in this particular fold of Wyoming that had been just dirt and sky and promise when Noah had built his first wall and was now, through 10 years of honest work and the daily choice to be good to each other, something considerably more than that. Behind them, the creek ran through its channels in the last of the light, clear and purposeful, finding its way where they had made a way for it to go. That was how it was, on the Pinto Creek Ranch in the autumn of 1892, and in all the good years that came after. Thomas eventually did take over the horse operation, as expected, and ran it with distinction. Rose went east for a year to study botany in a proper institution, which Jennie arranged with the focus of a woman who understood that education was not a luxury, and that her daughter's mind required proper feeding. And Rose came back and spent the rest of her working life applying what she had learned to the ranching and agricultural community of Wyoming Territory, which became Wyoming State in 1890. Writing a series of papers on prairie grass cultivation that were read by more people than she expected, and which carried the same quality of precise, patient attention that she had always brought to her garden. Joseph became, in his 30s, the person in the county that people brought their disputes to when they needed someone to listen carefully and think clearly before speaking, a kind of informal mediator whose usefulness to the community was one of those things that is hard to quantify but impossible to replace. Noah and Jennie grew old on their land with the ease of people who had put down deep roots on purpose and knew exactly where they were. They argued about things for the rest of their lives, which neither of them considered a problem, and they were right about different things on a rotating basis, which kept it honest. They read to each other in the evenings when the work was done and the children were grown and the house was quieter, the books they had been meaning to get to for years, taking turns choosing. Jennie never entirely stopped managing the breeding records, even after Thomas was running most of the operation, because she said she did not trust anyone to maintain the indexing system she had developed. And Thomas, who had grown into a man with his mother's eye for precision, told her that was fair. On their 20th wedding anniversary in October of 1902, Noah took her out to the rise above the creek where he had stood the evening 10 years before, and they looked at the ranch below them in the evening light. The house was larger again, and there were grandchildren now, Thomas having married a young woman from Cheyenne the previous year who was, Jennie had noted with approval, not someone who folded neatly into things. 20 years, Jennie said. 20 years, he agreed. She was looking at the ranch with the expression she had when she was adding something up. "Do you know," she said, "that I came here with 3 conditions and a willingness to leave if it didn't work out?" "I remember," he said. "And it has worked out," she said. "It has worked out," he said. She turned and looked at him, and her hair was silver at the temples now, and the gray-green eyes were the same as they had always been, clear and full and seeing everything. "Worth every mile," she said, in the voice she used for things she meant completely. He smiled, this man who had saddled his horse before he finished reading a letter and ridden 700 miles, because a woman's aunt had written that she was difficult and worth every mile, this man who had been right about that before he knew he was right about it. "Worth every mile," he said. "Worth every single one." And the creek ran below them through its channels, and the evening came in over the mountains, and the light in the windows of their house was warm and constant, and everything that had been built here was still standing, which was the only ending worth having and the one they had made together carefully and with their hands.